Hey everyone, tonight we're exploring one of the most overlooked aspects of medieval life, what it was actually like to try to sleep in a castle. While these mighty stone fortresses might seem romantic from a distance of centuries, the reality of spending the night within their walls was far less comfortable and considerably more hazardous than most people imagine. Before we begin this journey into the nighttime challenges of medieval castle life, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if these thoughtful explorations of historical realities resonate with you. Feel free to share in the comments where everyone is watching from tonight. It's always wonderful to see this global community. Now, settle in comfortably in your modern bed with its mattress, blankets and secure surroundings, and let's explore together what nighttime meant for medieval people living in castles, where sleep was anything but simple or safe. When modern people think about medieval castles, they often imagine romantic settings from fairy tales or movies, grand chambers with four-poster beds, roaring fireplaces keeping everything cosy, and peaceful nights of rest within impregnable walls. The reality was dramatically different and far less comfortable. Castles were built primarily as defensive military structures, not as comfortable residences, and this fundamental purpose shaped every aspect of castle life, including the experience of trying to sleep. Understanding why sleeping in a medieval castle was dangerous requires examining multiple dimensions: the physical environment created by stone construction, the genuine security threats that castles were built to defend against, the health challenges created by medieval sanitation and medical knowledge, the fire hazards that threatened wooden elements within stone walls, and the social dynamics that made even sleep a potentially risky activity depending on one's status and circumstances. The medieval night was fundamentally different from modern nighttime experiences. Without electric lighting, nights were profoundly dark, a darkness modern people rarely experience. Without central heating, nights could be bitterly cold even inside supposedly protective walls. Without modern security systems, every unusual sound could signal genuine danger. Without modern medicine, falling ill during the night could mean facing morning with serious health problems and no effective treatment. And without privacy as modern people understand it, sleep occurred in circumstances where one was often surrounded by others, creating both security through numbers and vulnerability through lack of private space. The experience of sleeping in a castle also varied enormously by social status. The lord and lady sleeping in the relative comfort of the great chamber faced different challenges than knights sleeping in halls or guards taking shifts on cold battlements, servants sleeping in whatever spaces they could find, children crowded together in nursery areas, and prisoners held in dungeons all had dramatically different nighttime experiences united only by the shared reality that sleep in a medieval castle was rarely the peaceful, restorative experience modern people expect. This exploration will examine the various factors that made sleeping in medieval castles challenging, and sometimes genuinely dangerous, revealing how the mighty fortresses that protected their inhabitants during the day created their own hazards once darkness fell, and people sought the rest their bodies needed. The most immediate challenge facing anyone trying to sleep in a medieval castle was the physical environment itself. Castles were constructed primarily from stone, an excellent material for defence, but a terrible material for creating comfortable living spaces. Understanding how stone construction affected the interior environment reveals why sleeping in castles was physically challenging, even before considering more dramatic dangers. Stone has thermal properties that made castle interiors uncomfortable year-round. During winter, stone absorbed cold from the outside environment and radiated it inward, creating interior spaces that were perpetually chilly regardless of heating efforts. The massive stone walls that made castles defensible also made them exceptionally difficult to warm. Heat from fireplaces was absorbed by surrounding stone rather than warming the air effectively, and the warmth that was generated quickly escaped through numerous gaps, drafts, and the general impossibility of truly sealing large stone structures. The cold was genuinely dangerous, not merely uncomfortable. Hypothermia was a real risk for those sleeping in poorly heated areas, particularly for the elderly, young children, and anyone already weakened by illness. Historical records occasionally mention people found dead in the morning from cold exposure, particularly servants or lower status individuals who slept in the least protected areas of castles. The windows in medieval castles were often open to the elements. While later medieval castles had glass windows in important rooms, an expensive luxury, many windows were simply openings in stone walls, sometimes covered with wooden shutters, oiled parchment or nothing at all. These openings provided necessary light and ventilation during the day, but created problematic drafts at night. Shuttering windows at night helped somewhat, but also eliminated what little moonlight might have provided illumination, forcing choices between cold drafts and pitch darkness. The floors were typically stone as well, cold and hard throughout the year. Some areas might have rushes scattered on floors, layers of dried plants that provided minimal insulation and absorbed some spills and debris. However, these rushes had their own problems, which we'll explore later. Wooden floors existed in some chambers, but were still cold compared to modern, heated and carpeted homes. Dampness plagued many castles. Stone walls absorbed moisture from rain, from groundwater seeping up from foundations, and from condensation created when warm interior air met cold stone surfaces. This dampness created perpetually clammy conditions that made cold feel even more penetrating. Clothes, bedding, and sleeping spaces felt perpetually slightly damp, creating discomfort and contributing to health problems. The bedding available did little to offset these environmental challenges. The wealthy slept on bed frames with rope or leather supports holding mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers depending on wealth and status. These medieval mattresses provided some cushioning but were far less comfortable than modern mattresses. They compressed unevenly, developed lumps, and offered limited support. The straw in cheaper mattresses broke down quickly, becoming uncomfortable and requiring frequent replacement. Those of lower status often had far less substantial bedding. Servants might sleep on simple straw pallets, essentially bags of straw laid on cold stone floors. Guards on duty might catch what sleep they could sitting upright or leaning against walls. The idea of everyone having their own comfortable bed is thoroughly modern. Medieval people of lower status considered themselves fortunate to have any dedicated sleeping space at all. Blankets and coverings were valuable possessions. Woolen blankets provided the best insulation available but were expensive. Cheaper coverings made from coarse fabric offered less warmth. Fur-lined coverlets were luxury items reserved for the wealthy. Even with multiple layers of blankets, truly cold winter nights could be miserable, with people sleeping in their daytime clothing for additional warmth, wrapping themselves in cloaks and huddling together for shared body heat. The lack of insulation between sleeping bodies and cold stone environments created another danger: illness. Sleeping in cold, damp conditions weakened immune systems and contributed to respiratory infections, pneumonia, and other cold-related illnesses. Medieval people understood that cold and damp were unhealthy. They sought warm, dry sleeping places when possible. But castle architecture made achieving such conditions difficult. The acoustics of stone construction created another challenge. Stone walls and floors amplified and transmitted sound throughout castles. Footsteps echoed down corridors, conversations carried through connecting chambers, and any nighttime disturbance, a crying baby, an argument, someone moving about, could be heard throughout large portions of the structure. This made peaceful sleep difficult, and also meant that nighttime emergencies were announced acoustically to wide areas of the castle. The stone construction also meant that once you were cold, warming up was difficult. In modern homes you can adjust heating, add blankets, or move to a warmer room quickly. In medieval castles, warming cold limbs required getting close to a fire, and fires had their own hazards. We'll explore shortly. The deep cold that penetrated into bone during long winter nights wasn't easily remedied, and people often woke feeling stiff, achy, and not particularly refreshed despite hours of sleep. The sheer size of many castles created additional problems. A person sleeping in a chamber might be far from the main hall's fire or from any heat source. Walking through cold corridors to reach sleeping quarters meant losing any warmth gained from sitting by evening fires. Some wealthy people had warming pans, metal containers filled with hot coals that could be placed in beds to warm them before sleeping, but these were luxuries most people lacked. The physical environment of stone castles thus created a baseline of discomfort that affected everyone. Though to varying degrees depending on their status and sleeping locations, the mighty walls that protected inhabitants from enemies couldn't protect them from cold, damp, and the fundamental incompatibility between defensive stone architecture and comfortable human habitation. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of sleeping in a medieval castle was the ever-present risk of fire. This might seem paradoxical. Weren't castles made of stone which doesn't burn? Indeed, the stone walls and floors were fireproof, but castles contained enormous amounts of flammable material that made fire a catastrophic threat, particularly during nighttime hours when fires might start and spread before being detected. The interiors of medieval castles contained extensive wooden elements, despite stone exteriors. Floors in upper stories were typically wood. Roof structures were timber supporting slate, thatch, or tile covering interior walls were often wood panelling rather than exposed stone. Furniture was wood. Doors were wood. Ceiling beams supporting floors above were massive timber. All of this wood was often very dry and highly flammable. The textiles in castles added to fire risk. Tapestries hanging on walls provided decoration and insulation, but were essentially large pieces of fabric ready to burn. Bed curtains and hangings around beds, used for warmth and privacy, were flammable rushes on floors, dried straw in mattresses, woolen blankets, clothing, and countless other fabric items throughout castles would all burn readily if exposed to flame. The sources of fire were numerous and difficult to control. Fireplaces in chambers and halls burned throughout cold months, with open flames that could shoot sparks. Torches mounted in brackets on walls provided illumination, their open flames flickering near wooden panelling and tapestries. Candles, made from tallow or beeswax depending on quality, were used extensively, their flames easily knocked over by careless movement. Oil lamps, though less common, also presented fire hazards. The particular danger during sleeping hours came from the difficulty of detecting and responding to fires in darkness. A fire starting in the middle of the night, perhaps from a fallen candle or a spark escaping a fireplace, could smoulder and spread significantly before anyone noticed. The stone walls that contained the fire also trapped smoke, creating toxic conditions even before flames became widespread. Many fire deaths resulted from smoke inhalation rather than burns, as sleeping people succumbed to smoke before waking or escaping. Historical records contain numerous accounts of catastrophic castle fires. The Tower of London experienced multiple serious fires throughout its history. Windsor Castle suffered major fires in both medieval and later periods. Countless smaller castles experienced devastating fires that destroyed wooden interiors even when stone walls survived. These weren't rare, freakish accidents. They were recurring tragedies that everyone understood as genuine risks. The sleeping arrangements that people used to combat cold actually increased fire risk. Bed curtains, heavy fabric hangings surrounding beds to trap warmth and provide privacy, were excellent fire fuel hanging close to sleepers' candles brought to bedside for late-night reading, or simply for comfort in the darkness could easily ignite these curtains if knocked over. The very measures people took to make sleeping more comfortable created additional hazards. Heating bedchambers created particular risks. The warming pans mentioned earlier, metal containers with hot coals used to warm beds, could start fires if coal spilled, or if the hot metal made contact with fabric. Some people brought braziers, metal containers holding burning coals, into sleeping chambers for warmth, creating significant fire and carbon monoxide poisoning risks. The desperate desire for warmth during freezing nights led people to take chances that sometimes proved fatal. The castle's defensive features that protected inhabitants from external enemies became death traps during fires. The narrow spiral staircases that made castles difficult to attack became bottlenecks when panicked people tried to evacuate. The thick walls and small windows that kept enemies out also kept smoke in and made escape difficult. Bars on windows meant to prevent intruders could trap people inside burning chambers. Thick wooden doors that provided security became obstacles when fleeing fire. Children and elderly people faced particular danger from fires. Children might not wake quickly enough to escape, or might become disoriented in smoke-filled darkness and hide rather than fleeing. Elderly or infirm individuals who had difficulty moving quickly could be trapped by fires that spread faster than they could evacuate. The social obligation that servants had to wake and assist their masters meant that servants sometimes died trying to rescue employers from burning chambers. The lack of organised firefighting meant that once fires started, responses were chaotic and often ineffective. Water had to be carried in buckets from wells or cisterns, a slow process insufficient to combat serious fires. The bucket brigade method, lines of people passing buckets, worked only if enough people could be roused and organised quickly, which was difficult during nighttime fires. Often, efforts focused on removing valuables and letting the fire burn itself out rather than actually extinguishing it. The aftermath of castle fires could be as dangerous as the fires themselves. Weakened structures might collapse hours or days after fires, killing those who thought danger had passed. Smoke damage to lungs caused lingering health problems, and sometimes death days or weeks after surviving the fire itself. The loss of shelter during winter months could prove fatal to those who survived the fire, but then faced exposure without adequate housing. Certain times of year created heightened fire risk. Winter, when fires burned most continuously for heating, and when people used more candles and torches due to longer nights, saw increased fire frequency. Holiday periods, with additional candles for celebration, and more people cooking created elevated risks. Dry summer periods made thatched roofs, common on outbuildings within castle walls, particularly vulnerable. The psychological burden of fire risk affected sleep quality. People aware that fire could start and spread while they slept must have experienced anxiety that interfered with truly restful sleep. The need to remain somewhat alert to danger created a state of hypervigilance incompatible with deep, restorative rest. This chronic low-level stress added to the other challenges of achieving good sleep in medieval castles. Some fire prevention measures existed but were imperfect. Fireplace designs included hoods and flues to contain sparks, though these didn't eliminate risk. Stone hearths prevented direct ignition of floors, but sparks could still travel. Rules about extinguishing fires and candles before sleep were common but not always followed, especially when cold conditions tempted people to leave fires burning for warmth. Metal containers for candles and sconces for torches reduced but didn't eliminate fire hazards. The very real possibility of dying in a nighttime fire made sleeping in medieval castles genuinely dangerous in ways that modern people, protected by fire-resistant materials, smoke detectors, sprinkler systems and professional fire departments, can barely imagine. Every night in a medieval castle included the quiet knowledge that fire could start, spread and kill before people could wake and respond. This danger wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was a recurring reality that everyone living in castles understood as among the most serious threats they faced. While fire was an ever-present danger during sleeping hours, castles also faced security threats that made nighttime particularly vulnerable periods. The very reason castles existed, to protect inhabitants from enemies, created ongoing anxiety about whether defences were adequate, particularly during the darkness when visibility was limited and attackers had advantages. The siege scenario created the most sustained threat to castle inhabitants. A castle under siege faced enemy forces surrounding the walls, attempting to breach defences through various means. The siege could last months, creating extended periods of heightened danger where every night brought the possibility of assault attempts. Defenders had to maintain constant vigilance, with guards posted throughout the night watching for scaling attempts, tunneling operations or other breaches. The guards themselves faced significant dangers during nighttime watches. Standing or walking on battlements in darkness, cold and sometimes foul weather, guards had to remain alert for hours despite exhaustion, boredom and physical discomfort. Guards risked falling from walls if they dozed or stumbled in darkness. In winter, guards faced genuine risk of freezing or suffering frostbite during long nighttime watches. Enemy archers might target guards visible against torch or moonlight, making guard duty actively dangerous during sieges. The psychological strain on guards during long nighttime watches created additional risks. Exhausted guards might fail to detect genuine threats, fall asleep at their posts, or raise false alarms about imaginary dangers. The castle's security depended on these tired, cold, uncomfortable men remaining alert throughout the night, and inevitable human failures in this regard created vulnerabilities that everyone understood but couldn't entirely prevent. For those trying to sleep during sieges or periods of military threat, the knowledge that the castle was under attack prevented restful sleep. Periodic sounds of enemy activity, horns, shouted orders, sounds of construction as besiegers built siege engines, reminded sleeping inhabitants of ongoing danger. The possibility that walls might be breached during the night, with enemies pouring into the castle while people slept, created anxiety that made deep sleep difficult. Historical accounts document numerous instances of castles being taken through nighttime operations. Attackers might discover or create breaches in walls, sneak through gates opened by treachery, or scale walls under cover of darkness. These nighttime captures often involve significant violence, as surprise defenders fought enemies who had penetrated their supposedly secure walls. The people sleeping in chambers under siege faced real possibility of waking to find enemies inside the castle, fighting through corridors and rooms. Even without active siege, internal security threats created danger. Large castle households included many people, not all of whom necessarily felt loyalty to the Lord. Personal conflicts, feuds, and grudges meant that violence between household members was a real possibility. Nighttime, when people were vulnerable in sleep, and when darkness provided cover for approach and escape, was an obvious time for someone planning violence. Historical records contain numerous accounts of nighttime murders in castles. Lords might be killed in their chambers by rivals or treacherous servants. Conflicts between household members sometimes erupted into deadly violence during nighttime hours. The combination of weapons being readily available, most men carried knives, and weapons were stored throughout castles, and the vulnerability of sleeping people created conditions where personal conflicts could turn lethal. The Lord and Lady's chamber was supposed to be secure, often accessible only through other rooms where trusted servants slept, providing layers of protection. However, this security was imperfect. Servants themselves might be suborned by enemies. Secret passages, real or rumoured, in many castles created anxiety about hidden approaches to supposedly secure chambers. Windows, even when high up, might be accessible to determined attackers willing to climb walls. Women in castles faced particular vulnerabilities during nighttime hours. The risk of sexual assault was real and understood, creating anxiety for women sleeping in less protected areas. Servants, noble daughters, and even ladies of high status faced potential danger from men within the castle, who might take advantage of nighttime darkness and vulnerability. The social and legal protections that theoretically existed were imperfect, and the shame and dishonour associated with sexual assault meant many attacks went unreported or unpunished. Children sleeping in nursery areas faced their own vulnerabilities. In times of serious conflict, children of lords were valuable hostages or targets for enemies seeking to hurt their parents. Dedicated nurses and guards tried to protect noble children, but the possibility of kidnapping or harm during nighttime infiltrations was real. Historical records document cases of children being abducted from castles or harmed during attacks. The paranoia that living under such threats created affected mental health and sleep quality. People who believed they might be attacked during sleep experience heightened stress hormones, lighter sleep, and increased nighttime waking. The body remains in a state of partial alertness even during sleep, preventing the deep rest necessary for health. This chronic stress from security concerns contributed to the general unhealthiness of castle life. Prisoners held in castle dungeons or towers faced extreme vulnerability during nighttime hours. Imprisoned in dark, cold spaces with minimal supervision, prisoners might die from neglect, cold, hunger, or violence from guards during night hours when witnesses were absent. The dungeons beneath castles, dark, damp chambers carved from rock beneath the structure, were genuinely terrible places where nighttime brought intensified misery and danger. The social hierarchy determined whose security was prioritised. Lords and their families received the most protection, sleeping in the most secure chambers with guards and servants, providing layers of security. Knights and important household members had some protection. Ordinary servants and workers had minimal security, sleeping in halls, corridors, or whatever spaces they could find with little protection from threats either external or internal. The weapons kept for defence also created danger. Castles contained armories full of swords, spears, crossbows, and other weapons. During the day, these were controlled and generally secure, but at night, particularly during periods of conflict or confusion, these weapons could be seized by anyone with access: rebels, treacherous servants, or attackers who breached defences. The presence of so many deadly weapons throughout the castle meant that conflicts could escalate to lethal violence quickly. The dogs kept in castles for hunting, and security added another element of danger, particularly at night. Large hunting dogs, or guard dogs, while protecting against intruders, could also be dangerous to inhabitants. Children might be bitten, and dogs might attack people who startled them in darkness. The dog bites could become infected, creating serious health risks in an era without antibiotics. Beyond the immediate dangers of fire and violence, sleeping in medieval castles involved exposure to health hazards that created slower but equally real threats to life and well-being. The combination of poor sanitation, limited medical knowledge, and the crowded conditions of castle life made nighttime particularly hazardous to health. The sanitation facilities in medieval castles were primitive and created ongoing health problems. Latrines, called garderobes in castle contexts, were typically small chambers built into walls with openings that dropped waist-down chutes to the outside or into castle moats. While this design kept waste away from living spaces theoretically, the system had numerous problems. The smell from garderobes permeated nearby chambers, despite medieval attempts to mitigate it by locating latrines in projecting towers or far corners of buildings. The practice of storing clothing in garderobes, based on the belief that the ammonia from urine would deter moths, meant that people's clothes absorbed unpleasant odours. At night, when people needed to use facilities, they had to navigate dark corridors to reach garderobes, or they used chamber pots in sleeping chambers that sat overnight, accumulating waste and creating both smell and health hazards. The waste accumulating beneath castles or in moats created breeding grounds for disease-carrying organisms. While medieval people didn't understand germ theory, they recognised that filth was associated with illness. The proximity of waste to living spaces, particularly in lower areas of castles, or places where drainage was poor, created ongoing exposure to pathogens that caused dysentery, typhoid, and other serious illnesses. The water available in castles for washing was limited and often contaminated. Wells within castle walls provided some water, but this was primarily used for drinking and cooking rather than extensive washing. The amount of water needed to truly clean bodies, clothes and bedding was far more than most castle systems could reliably provide, especially during sieges when water conservation became critical. The infrequent bathing that resulted from limited water, and the difficulty of heating enough water for baths, meant that medieval people living in castles were chronically dirty by modern standards. The skin diseases, body lice and various infections that flourished in these conditions created constant discomfort and health problems. At night, the itching from lice and flea bites prevented restful sleep, and could lead to scratching that caused open sores vulnerable to infection. The crowded sleeping conditions in many areas of castles facilitated disease transmission. Servants sleeping together in halls, children crowded in nursery spaces, and even lords and ladies sleeping in chambers with various attendants nearby created conditions where respiratory infections, tuberculosis, and other contagious illnesses spread easily. Someone coughing or sneezing in a crowded sleeping space at night could infect numerous others before morning. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that ill people weren't effectively isolated from healthy ones. Someone developing measles, smallpox, or other serious infectious disease might continue sleeping in shared spaces until the disease progressed to obvious symptoms, by which point they had already exposed numerous others. The nighttime hours when people slept in proximity created ideal conditions for disease spread that medieval people couldn't prevent because they didn't understand the mechanisms involved. The food consumed before bed sometimes contributed to nighttime illness. Food preservation in medieval times was imperfect, and food spoilage was common. Eating spoiled food in the evening could lead to food poisoning that struck during nighttime hours, causing severe vomiting and diarrhea. In dark, cold conditions, dealing with such illness was miserable and sometimes dangerous. Severe dehydration from food poisoning could be fatal, particularly for children or elderly people. The medications and treatments available when people fell ill at night were limited and often harmful. Medieval medicine relied heavily on balancing humours through bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies. When someone became ill during the night, attendants might administer treatments that were ineffective at best, and actively harmful at worst. Bloodletting weakened already ill people. Purges caused dangerous dehydration, and some herbal preparations were toxic. The cold, damp castle environment contributed directly to various illnesses. Respiratory infections flourished in such conditions, and the stone magnified transmission of disease through droplets spread when people coughed or breathed heavily. Rheumatism and arthritis worsened in damp, cold conditions, causing pain that prevented restful sleep and gradually crippled sufferers over years of exposure. Dental problems created another source of nighttime misery. Medieval diets and limited dental care meant that tooth decay and abscesses were common. Dental pain could be excruciating, particularly at night when there were fewer distractions from the pain. An abscessed tooth could lead to serious infections that spread to the jaw, face, or bloodstream, potentially proving fatal. People suffering dental pain had limited relief available. Herbal pain remedies like willow bark, containing compounds similar to modern aspirin, provided some help, but severe dental issues required extraction, a painful procedure with infection risks. The parasites that lived in medieval bedding created both discomfort and disease. Bed bugs, though not yet as widespread as they would become in later centuries, did exist and caused itching bites fleas carried by dogs, cats and rats, transmitted diseases including bubonic plague. Lice spread typhus. The bites from these parasites created openings in skin vulnerable to bacterial infection. The constant presence of parasites made sleep uncomfortable and contributed to the general unhealthiness of castle life. Pregnancy and childbirth created particular nighttime health hazards for women. Pregnancy complications could strike at night. Bleeding, premature labour, or other emergencies that required immediate assistance but occurred when help was less available. Childbirth itself often occurred at night, and the combination of pain, danger, and limited medical capability made nighttime births particularly risky. The maternal mortality rate was high, and many women who went into labour during nighttime hours didn't survive to see the next day. The mental health impacts of living under constant stress, in uncomfortable conditions, with ongoing health problems, affected sleep quality and overall well-being. Medieval people experienced depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions just as modern people do, but lacked effective treatments. The combination of psychological distress with difficult life circumstances created conditions where many people struggled to achieve truly restful sleep, even when physical conditions allowed it. The ventilation in castles was generally poor despite drafts from windows and gaps in construction. Sleeping chambers with fires burning throughout the night risked carbon monoxide poisoning if ventilation was inadequate. The symptoms, headache, confusion, nausea, might not wake sleeping people until levels were dangerously high. Some deaths attributed to dying in sleep may actually have been carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated chambers with fires burning overnight. Beyond the microscopic pathogens and parasites that threatened health, medieval castles housed numerous larger creatures that made nighttime unpleasant and sometimes dangerous. The combination of food stores, living humans, inadequate waste disposal, and construction featuring numerous gaps and hiding places created ideal conditions for various pests that made sleep difficult and occasionally hazardous. Rats were ubiquitous in medieval castles, thriving on food scraps, stored grain, and waste. These weren't the relatively small modern rats people might encounter occasionally. Medieval rats could be quite large, bold, and aggressive when threatened or desperate. At night, rats emerged from hiding places to forage, their movements creating sounds that disturbed light sleepers, and their presence creating genuine danger. The most obvious danger from rats was plague. The bubonic plague that devastated medieval Europe was transmitted by fleas living on rats. While medieval people didn't understand this mechanism, they blamed plague on bad air, astrological influences, or divine punishment. They did recognise that rats were associated with filth and disease. Having rats in sleeping areas increased plague exposure, creating deadly consequences during outbreak periods. Beyond plague, rats could bite sleeping people, particularly infants or small children who couldn't defend themselves. Rat bites could become seriously infected, creating health problems that sometimes proved fatal in the absence of antibiotics. The historical record contains accounts of infants being bitten by rats during the night, sometimes with tragic consequences. The psychological impact of sharing sleeping spaces with rats was significant. The sounds of rats moving, squeaking, and fighting during nighttime hours prevented peaceful sleep. The knowledge that rats might approach sleeping people, crawl across beds, or get into food stores created anxiety that made deep sleep difficult. People had to protect food carefully and secure belongings to prevent rat damage. Mice were even more numerous than rats, though less dangerous individually. Their ability to squeeze through tiny gaps meant that keeping them out of chambers was nearly impossible. Mice nested in bedding, chewed on clothing and stored fabric, contaminated food, and generally created nuisance conditions throughout castles. Their droppings and urine contributed to unsanitary conditions and unpleasant smells. Cats were kept partly to control rodents, and their nighttime hunting activities created their own disturbances. Cats fighting, mating, or simply roaming created noise during nighttime hours. While cats did reduce rodent populations, they couldn't eliminate them, and the presence of numerous cats in castles created additional complications. Cat scratchers could become infected, and cats themselves could be aggressive when protecting territory or kittens. Dogs, as mentioned earlier, were common in castles for hunting, guarding, and companionship. Large hunting dogs sometimes slept in their masters' chambers for warmth and security. While this provided some comfort and protection, it also meant sharing sleeping spaces with animals that had fleas might have aggressive moments, and certainly didn't contribute to cleanliness. Dog bites during nighttime confusion were possible, and the general hygiene problems of cohabitating with dogs added to health hazards. Bats roosted in castle roofs, towers, and unused chambers. While bats are generally harmless and even beneficial due to insect consumption, they did occasionally enter inhabited areas during nighttime flights. The sudden appearance of a bat in a chamber could startle sleeping people, and the association of bats with darkness and night created superstitious fears. Medieval people didn't understand rabies transmission, but did recognise that bat bites could cause illness. Birds, particularly pigeons and swallows, nested in castle structures, and could enter inhabited areas through openings. Their droppings were acidic and corrosive, damaging stone and creating health hazards. The histoplasmosis fungus that grows in bird droppings causes respiratory illness when spores are inhaled. While medieval people didn't understand the mechanism, they recognised that areas with heavy bird presence were unhealthy. Insects beyond fleas and lice created constant annoyance. Mosquitoes bred in moats and marshland near castles, entering through windows during warm months and biting sleeping people. While mosquitoes in medieval Europe didn't generally carry malaria, which had been largely eliminated from northern Europe by the medieval period, their bites were itchy and annoying. Preventing restful sleep, repeated scratching of bites could lead to infected sores. Spiders were numerous in castle corners and unused spaces. While most European spiders weren't dangerous, their webs accumulated in sleeping chambers, and finding spiders in beds was common. The psychological aversion many people have to spiders created discomfort, even when the spiders themselves weren't truly dangerous. The larger hunting spiders that might appear on walls or ceilings were particularly disturbing to those with spider phobias. Beetles and other crawling insects found their way into sleeping areas, attracted by food scraps, fabric, wood, or simply seeking shelter. Carpet beetles, though carpets weren't common, and clothes moths damaged textiles, creating economic loss, as expensive fabrics were gradually destroyed. The larval stages of these insects lived in stored fabrics, and could cause skin irritation if they came in contact with sleeping people. Bed bugs, though less common in medieval Europe than they would become later, did exist and caused miserable itching during nighttime hours. These insects hid in bed frames, mattresses and wall crevices during the day, emerging at night to feed on sleeping people. Their bites caused itching that lasted for days, and heavy infestations could cause sleep deprivation through constant biting and irritation. The straw and rushes used as floor covering and mattress stuffing provided habitat for numerous small creatures. Mites living in organic debris caused allergic reactions and respiratory problems. The degrading plant material hosted fungi and bacteria that affected air quality. Periodically, rushes were replaced with fresh material, but the interval between replacements meant living with increasingly contaminated floor covering. The presence of so many creatures sharing castle space with humans meant that nighttime was never truly quiet or peaceful. The sounds of animals moving, insects buzzing or clicking, and various creatures going about their nocturnal activities created constant low-level disturbance. For people trying to sleep, this ambient noise combined with the other challenges of castle life to prevent truly deep restorative rest. The efforts to control these pests were limited by medieval technology and understanding. Cats and dogs helped with rodent control but couldn't eliminate the problem. Herbs with repellent properties, lavender, mint, wormwood, were scattered among rushes or stored with clothes to deter insects, providing some relief but not eliminating infestations. Cleanliness helped, but the difficulty of maintaining cleanliness in stone structures with inadequate water meant that pest control was an ongoing, mostly losing battle. The profound darkness that descended on medieval castles at night created challenges that modern people accustomed to electric lighting can barely imagine. The absence of reliable illumination affected everything from navigation to security to the simple psychological comfort that light provides. Understanding medieval nighttime darkness reveals another dimension of why sleeping in castles was challenging and dangerous. Once the sun set, darkness in castles was nearly absolute in areas without deliberate illumination. Stone corridors, chambers and stairways became pitch black, making movement dangerous and creating disorientation. The thick walls and small windows that made castles defensible also prevented moonlight from penetrating deeply into structures even on bright nights. Interior spaces remained dark regardless of external light conditions. The light sources available were limited and inadequate by modern standards. Torches, wooden staffs with cloth or pitch-soaked ends that burned, provided substantial light, but created fire hazards, smoke, and unpleasant smells. They also required constant attention, as they burned out relatively quickly and needed replacement. Keeping torches lit throughout the night in corridors and important areas required dedicated effort and created ongoing fire risk. Candles provided more controlled lighting but were expensive and also required attention. Tallow candles made from animal fat were cheaper but burned with smoky flames and unpleasant smell. Beeswax candles burned cleaner but were expensive luxuries. Both types required trimming of wicks to prevent smoking and provided only modest illumination. A single candle creates far less light than people might imagine, if they're only familiar with electric lighting. Oil lamps, though less common than candles or torches, provided another lighting option. These used vegetable oils or animal fats as fuel, burning with wicks that required trimming. Oil lamps provided steadier light than candles in drafty conditions, but required careful filling and maintenance. They also presented fire risks if knocked over, as burning oil could spread flames rapidly. The cost of maintaining nighttime illumination meant that light was carefully rationed. Only the most important areas, guard posts, main halls during gatherings, the Lord's chambers, received continuous nighttime lighting. Most of the castle remained dark, with people carrying individual candles or lamps when they needed to move about at night. This created islands of light in seas of darkness, with the vast majority of the castle structure remaining unlit. Moving through dark castle spaces at night was genuinely dangerous. The stone stairs, particularly the spiral stairs in towers, were treacherous when navigating by inadequate candlelight or in total darkness. The steps were often uneven, worn smooth from use, and designed to favour defenders going upward and hinder attackers climbing. But these defensive features also made them difficult to navigate safely at night. Falls down stone stairs could result in serious injury or death. The corridors connecting chambers were obstacles courses in darkness. Medieval castles weren't designed with the clean, clear pathways that modern buildings have. Corridors might have uneven floors, unexpected steps, low doorways, or various objects stored along walls. Navigating these spaces in darkness meant moving slowly and carefully, feeling one's way along walls and testing each step. Even then, people could trip, walk into things, or get disoriented. The psychological impact of profound darkness was significant. Humans have instinctive fear responses to darkness, rooted in evolutionary history when nighttime brought genuine danger from predators. Living in environments where darkness was the norm during nighttime hours created anxiety and stress. The sounds that occurred in darkness, unexplained creaks, animal movements, distant voices, could trigger fear responses that modern people rarely experience. For children, the darkness in medieval castles must have been particularly frightening. Young children afraid of the dark had no nightlights to comfort them, no way to illuminate their spaces if they woke, frightened during the night. They had to either endure their fear or call for adults to bring light. This experience of profound childhood darkness likely contributed to the medieval mindset that accepted danger and discomfort as normal life conditions. The religious and superstitious beliefs surrounding nighttime and darkness added psychological layers to the physical challenges. Medieval people believed that nighttime brought increased demonic activity, that evil spirits moved more freely in darkness, and that various supernatural dangers emerged when daylight ended. Whether or not individuals fully believed these ideas, the cultural saturation of such beliefs created background anxiety about nighttime that modern secular culture largely lacks. The practical challenges of performing necessary nighttime activities without adequate light created various problems. Using the garderobe at night meant navigating dark corridors while managing clothing and avoiding falls near openings that dropped to the outside. Tending to sick children or household members at night required bringing light while managing medical needs. Even simple activities like finding clothing, securing doors, or checking on unusual sounds became complicated tasks requiring careful management of limited light sources. The fire hazards created by nighttime lighting have been mentioned but bear repeating in this context. The very tools used to combat dangerous darkness, candles, torches, oil lamps, created their own dangers. Walking through corridors with open flames, placing candles near beds for comfort, or using torches near flammable materials all created fire risks. The need for light thus created constant tension between the danger of darkness and the danger of the fire used to illuminate it. Guard duty at night required managing lighting carefully. Guards needed some illumination to see approaching threats, but excessive light made them visible targets and potentially blinded them to dangers in darkness beyond their lit areas. The balance between useful illumination and dangerous visibility required constant judgment. Guards also had to maintain their light sources throughout long watches, managing the practical challenges of keeping torches or lanterns burning in wind and weather. The seasonal variations in night length created additional challenges. In winter, when nights were longest and cold most severe, the extended periods of darkness meant more time navigating dangerous conditions and more cost in maintaining nighttime illumination. Summer nights, though shorter, still involved several hours of darkness that required the same careful management. The variation meant that nighttime routines had to adapt to changing day lengths throughout the year. The social dynamics of who received light and who didn't reflected broader status hierarchies. Lords and ladies had servants to carry lights for them, and could afford to keep chambers illuminated. They could summon additional light whenever needed. Lower status people had to manage with minimal light, often sharing single candles among groups and making do with darkness when light sources were depleted. This inequality in access to light added to the many ways that castle life was dramatically different for people of different social standings. Given all the dangers and challenges associated with sleeping in medieval castles, the preparations people made before retiring for the night were extensive and crucially important. Understanding these nighttime routines reveals both the practical adaptations medieval people developed and the constant effort required to make sleep even marginally safe and comfortable. As darkness approached, the castle shifted from daytime activities to nighttime preparations. This transition was gradual, beginning when daylight started to fade and continuing until full darkness descended. The timing varied by season. Winter transitions happened much earlier than summer ones, but the basic pattern remained consistent. The evening meal, supper, was typically eaten while daylight remained or shortly after darkness fell. This timing meant that food could be prepared during daylight hours and consumed before the challenges of eating in dim lighting became overwhelming. After supper, various closing up tasks began throughout the castle as people prepared for nighttime conditions. Securing the castle against external threats was a priority. Gates were closed and barred, their massive wooden doors reinforced with iron bars that fitted into stone brackets. The drawbridge, if the castle had one, was raised. Guards were posted at key locations: gates, towers, battlements, and important interior positions. The rotation of guard watches was organised to ensure continuous vigilance throughout the night, despite the guards' need for some rest. Interior doors in important areas were locked or barred. The lord and lady's chambers would be secured, with only trusted servants having access. Treasuries and armories were carefully locked. Storerooms containing valuable supplies were secured against theft. The closing and securing of doors throughout the castle created a nightly ritual that everyone understood as necessary for safety. The fires throughout the castle required careful attention before sleep. In the Great Hall, fires that had burned all day needed tending, either careful banking to keep coals alive through the night, for easier rekindling in the morning, or complete extinguishing if fire safety concerns outweighed the convenience of maintaining coals. In chambers where fires burned throughout the night for warmth, guards or screens were positioned to prevent sparks from escaping. The positioning of these fire screens required careful judgment. Too close and they might themselves catch fire from the heat. too far and they didn't effectively contain sparks. Servants responsible for fire management had to check every fire, adjust fuel to achieve slow, safe burning, and ensure that no flammable materials were dangerously close to flames. This nightly fire management was serious business that could mean the difference between safe sleep and catastrophic fire. Personal hygiene routines before bed were limited by medieval standards but did occur. People might wash faces and hands using water from pitchers kept in chambers. Teeth might be cleaned using cloths, twigs, or simple brushes. Though dental hygiene was far from modern standards, hair was combed to remove tangles and debris. These basic preparations helped somewhat with comfort and cleanliness, even though they fell far short of modern nighttime hygiene routines. Chamber pots were positioned conveniently for nighttime use. These pottery or metal containers served as toilets during nighttime hours. When navigating dark corridors to reach guardrobes was too difficult or dangerous, servants would empty chamber pots in the morning, but overnight they remained in sleeping chambers, contributing to odours and sanitation challenges but providing necessary convenience. Bedding was prepared with whatever warming measures were available. Warming pans with hot coals might be run over sheets to warm beds before people entered them. Additional blankets would be piled on beds in cold weather. Bed curtains were drawn closed to trap whatever warmth sleeping bodies generated, and to provide a sense of enclosure and security. These preparations helped somewhat with comfort, but couldn't truly overcome the fundamental coldness of stone castle environments. Clothing for sleeping varied by period, status, and personal preference. Some people slept in their daytime undergarments, long linen shirts for men, chemises for women, providing modest covering while allowing some ventilation. Others slept in dedicated night clothes that were similar but perhaps slightly cleaner or finer. In very cold conditions, people slept fully dressed, removing only outer garments and keeping everything else on for warmth. The arrangement of sleeping bodies required organisation in shared sleeping spaces. Servants sleeping in halls needed to find their spots and settle in without encroaching on others' spaces. Children in nurseries had to be tucked in, with any who were frightened or unsettled being comforted. Multiple people sharing beds, a common practice to maximise warmth, had to arrange themselves to avoid discomfort while benefiting from shared body heat. Prayers before sleep were important parts of nighttime routines for most medieval people. These weren't necessarily lengthy or formal prayers. They might be simple expressions of faith and requests for protection through the night. The religious framework of medieval life made prayer a natural part of daily routines, and bedtime prayers provided spiritual comfort in the face of nighttime dangers, both real and imagined. Weapons were positioned accessibly in case of nighttime emergencies. Lords might have swords near their beds, within reach if danger threatened. Guards on duty obviously kept their weapons ready. Even servants might have knives or other implements that could serve as weapons if necessary. The presence of so many weapons throughout castle sleeping areas reflected the reality that nighttime could bring violence, requiring immediate response. Infants and small children required particular attention during nighttime preparations. Babies were swaddled tightly, wrapped in cloth to restrict movement. Based on beliefs that this promoted healthy growth and prevented injury, toddlers and young children were settled into their sleeping places, often with multiple children sharing beds for warmth. Older children who slept separately from younger siblings had their own preparations, positioning themselves in whatever spaces were designated for them. The assignment of sleeping spaces for servants and lower status residents was part of nighttime routine. Space was limited, and people needed to claim spots early enough to avoid being left without adequate sleeping areas. The social dynamics of who slept where, who got spots near fires versus cold corners, who received thin pallets versus bare floors, played out through informal hierarchies and sometimes conflicts. The final rounds through the castle before sleep involved checking that everything was secure. Trusted servants or castle officials would walk through key areas, verifying that fires were safe, doors were locked, important items were secured, and nothing seemed amiss. These inspection rounds provided a last layer of security and fire prevention before the castle settled into nighttime vulnerability. For the lord and lady, the nighttime preparation was more elaborate. Servants helped them undress, storing daytime clothing carefully. Their chamber was secured and made as comfortable as possible. Trusted servants positioned themselves in antechambers or nearby spaces where they could respond to nighttime summons. The bedtime routine for the castle's higher status residents emphasised their privileged position while also highlighting their dependence on servants for safety and comfort. The psychological preparation for sleep involved accepting the various dangers and discomforts as simply normal life conditions. Medieval people didn't lie awake every night in terror. They had adapted to their circumstances and generally slept despite the challenges. However, this adaptation came with costs: lighter sleep, increased nighttime waking, and the chronic stress that comes from sleeping in conditions where genuine dangers exist. The various preparations people made before sleep reveal both ingenuity in adapting to difficult conditions and the enormous effort required to make sleep even marginally safe and comfortable. Modern people simply go to bed, trusting that their environments are secure, warm enough, and safe from fire. Medieval castle residents had to actively create whatever safety and comfort they achieved, with imperfect results despite their best efforts. The experience of sleeping in a medieval castle varied dramatically depending on social status, with the challenges and dangers distributed unequally across the social hierarchy. Understanding these variations reveals how medieval social structures shaped even the most basic human need for rest. At the apex of castle society, the lord and lady enjoyed the best sleeping accommodations the castle offered. Their chamber, typically located in the most secure part of the castle, was the largest and best appointed sleeping space. It contained the finest bed the household could afford, with rope or leather support under a feather mattress rather than straw, linen sheets rather than coarse fabric, and multiple wool or fur blankets for warmth. The lord and lady's chamber was defensible, usually accessible only through other rooms where trusted servants slept. This arrangement provided security through layers. Potential attackers would have to pass through multiple spaces, encountering resistance before reaching the lord and lady. The chamber often had a fireplace providing warmth throughout the night, a luxury not available in most sleeping spaces. Windows might have glass rather than just shutters, providing better weather protection. However, even the lord and lady faced nighttime challenges. Their chamber, while the best available, was still cold by modern standards. The stone walls absorbed cold and radiated it inward despite the fireplace dampness affected even the best chambers. The security measures that protected them also created vulnerability. Being in the innermost chamber meant that fire, attack, or other dangers might block escape routes before they could be reached. The lack of privacy that modern people expect was absent even for the highest status residents. Servants slept in antechambers or even in the lord and lady's chamber itself, ready to respond to nighttime needs. The concept of the bedroom as a private space for a couple alone is modern. Medieval sleeping arrangements assumed that servants would be present or immediately available throughout the night. Nobles and high-status household members, important knights, officials, close family members, had smaller chambers in towers or along walls. These rooms were less spacious and less well-appointed than the lord's chamber, but still relatively comfortable by castle standards. They might have simple fireplaces or braziers for heat, beds with frames and decent mattresses, and some security for valuable possessions. However, they lacked the layered protection of the lord's chamber, and might be more vulnerable to various nighttime dangers. Knights and military officers who weren't in the highest tier often slept in halls or barracks-like arrangements. Multiple knights might share a large chamber, each with a bed or sleeping space but without individual privacy. These shared sleeping quarters created camaraderie, but also generated conflicts, snoring and other disturbances, and general lack of peace. The military men sharing these spaces had to navigate social dynamics carefully to avoid conflicts in close quarters. Servants occupied the most varied and generally least comfortable sleeping accommodations. High-status servants, the chamberlain, the steward, the marshal, might have their own small chambers or share rooms with a few others of similar status. These servants' accommodations were modest, but provided some privacy and comfort compared to lower-status servants. Ordinary servants, the bulk of the household staff, slept wherever spaces could be found. In the great hall, servants laid out straw pallets or simple bedrolls after the evening activities concluded, sleeping on the floor where daytime life had occurred. These hall sleeping arrangements provided no privacy, minimal comfort, and exposure to cold drafts from doors and windows. Servants sleeping in halls had to rise early to roll up their bedding and prepare the hall for the day's activities before the lord and family appeared. Kitchen servants might sleep near the kitchens, in spaces that were warm from cooking fires, but also smoke-filled and smelly. Stable hands slept in or near stables, sharing space with horses and dealing with the odours and drafts of those structures. Laundry workers, craftsmen, and other specialised servants found sleeping spaces near their work areas, with varying degrees of comfort and security. Female servants faced particular challenges and dangers, sleeping in shared spaces with male servants, or in areas where men had access, created vulnerability to sexual assault. While serious effort was made to protect high-status women, noble daughters and ladies, lower-status female servants had far less protection. The social dynamics that allowed sexual exploitation of female servants by higher-status men meant that nighttime brought particular anxiety for women trying to sleep in insecure locations. Children's sleeping arrangements also reflected social hierarchy. Noble children slept in nurseries with dedicated servants, nurses and attendants, watching over them. These nursery spaces were reasonably comfortable and secure, with the children receiving care and protection throughout the night. As children grew older, boys might transition to sleeping with male household members, while girls remained in protected chambers with female attendants. Servants' children, when they lived in the castle, had far less comfortable arrangements. They might sleep with their parents in cramped servants' quarters, or in groups in spaces designated for castle children of lower status. These children received minimal supervision and protection compared to noble children, and their sleeping conditions were correspondingly worse. Pages, young boys from noble families sent to castles to learn knightly skills and court behaviour, occupied an intermediate position. They weren't servants, but weren't yet knights. They slept in shared chambers, learning to endure discomfort and to navigate social hierarchies. Their sleeping arrangements were better than servants, but far from luxurious, reflecting their status as youths in training rather than established household members. Prisoners represented the bottom of the castle social hierarchy, and their sleeping conditions were correspondingly terrible. Those imprisoned in dungeons, the dark chambers carved into castle foundations, slept on bare stone or minimal straw in cold, damp, often completely dark spaces. These prisoners had no comfort, no warmth, and little hope. The conditions were genuinely terrible, and many prisoners died from exposure, illness, or simply the accumulated effects of the horrific environment. Higher status prisoners, nobles captured in warfare, received better treatment, held in tower chambers rather than dungeons. These prisoners had modest comforts and weren't subjected to the worst deprivations, reflecting both their status and the hope that they would eventually be ransomed. However, even these relatively well-treated prisoners faced the anxiety and discomfort of captivity, sleeping in secure chambers, but ones that were nonetheless prisons. The distribution of nighttime discomfort and danger thus followed the social hierarchy precisely. Those at the top had the best protection, comfort and security that medieval technology and social organisation could provide. Those at the bottom endured terrible conditions with minimal protection. The vast middle experienced varying degrees of discomfort, with their specific nighttime experiences reflecting their exact position in the complex social web of castle life. This inequality was simply accepted as natural by medieval people. The social hierarchy was understood to be divinely ordained, with everyone having their proper place. The fact that lords slept in warm beds, while servants slept on cold floors, wasn't viewed as injustice, but as natural order, reflecting proper social relations. Modern sensibilities that value equality would have been incomprehensible to most medieval people, who saw hierarchy as both inevitable and right. However, the shared experience of sleeping in a castle, however unequally distributed the dangers and discomforts were, did create some common ground. Everyone faced cold, everyone dealt with darkness, everyone knew that fire could start or enemies attack during the night. These shared vulnerabilities created bonds across social divisions, even as the specific experiences remained dramatically different. The experience of sleeping in a medieval castle varied dramatically across seasons and with changing weather conditions. The stone structures that provided protection year-round created different challenges depending on external conditions, and understanding these seasonal variations reveals another dimension of nighttime castle life. Winter was the most challenging season for sleeping in castles. The combination of long nights, extreme cold, and harsh weather created conditions that tested everyone's endurance. The stone walls that made castles defensible became conductors of cold, drawing warmth from interior spaces and creating perpetually frigid conditions. The thickness of walls that protected against weapons also meant that external cold penetrated deeply into the structure's thermal mass. Snow and ice created additional challenges. Snow accumulating on roofs could melt and seep through gaps, creating drips that wetted bedding and sleeping areas. Ice formed in corners and on windows, a visible reminder of how cold interior temperatures dropped. The moisture from people's breath condensed on cold walls and surfaces, creating dampness that made cold feel even more penetrating. The shortened winter days meant extended periods of darkness requiring illumination. This increased the fire hazard from candles, torches and lamps burning throughout long nights. The cost of maintaining light for 14 or more hours of darkness was substantial, meaning that most areas remained unlit and people spent long periods in darkness. Heating challenges were most severe in winter. Fireplaces burned continuously, consuming enormous quantities of firewood. However, the heat they generated was often inadequate to truly warm the massive stone spaces people clustered near fires when awake, but had to sleep in areas that were barely warmer than the outside temperature despite the fires burning. The contrast between the warmth near fires and the cold of sleeping areas was dramatic and uncomfortable. Frost could form inside castles on particularly cold nights, with ice appearing on windows, walls, and even sometimes in chamber pots where liquid had frozen overnight. Waking to find one's breath visible in the air, to feel stiff with cold despite being under multiple blankets, was common winter experience. The health risks of sleeping in such conditions, hypothermia, frostbite, increased vulnerability to illness, were very real. Spring brought relief from winter's worst cold but created its own challenges. The melting of accumulated snow and ice created water that seeped into castle structures, increasing dampness. The variable weather, warm days followed by cold nights, made it difficult to judge what sleeping preparations were needed. Spring storms could be severe, with wind and rain penetrating through windows and creating uncomfortable sleeping conditions. The lengthening days in spring meant shorter periods of darkness, reducing illumination needs and fire hazards somewhat. However, the lingering cold of early spring meant that heating was still necessary during nighttime hours. The seasonal transition from winter to spring was often uncomfortable, with conditions not quite as harsh as winter, but still far from pleasant. Summer provided the most comfortable sleeping conditions, relatively speaking. The warmth meant that cold was less of a problem, and people could sleep without needing multiple layers of blankets or dealing with frigid conditions. The shorter nights meant less time in darkness and reduced illumination needs. Windows could be left open for ventilation without creating unbearable cold drafts. However, summer had its own challenges. The stone that conducted cold in winter also absorbed and radiated heat during summer. On particularly hot days, castle interiors could become uncomfortably warm, with stone walls radiating stored heat back into living spaces during nighttime hours. The thick walls that provided insulation also trapped heat, creating conditions where interior spaces remained hot, even after external temperatures cooled. Insects were most problematic during summer months. Mosquitoes, flies, and other pests that were dormant during winter became active and numerous. Without window screens, keeping insects out while maintaining ventilation was impossible. Sleeping people were bitten repeatedly, creating discomfort and sometimes transmitting disease. The heat also increased problems with sanitation and smell. Waste decomposed more rapidly in warm weather, creating stronger odours. The smell from guardrobes intensified chamber pots that sat overnight in chambers were more unpleasant in warm weather. The general hygiene challenges of castle life were more noticeable during summer heat. Thunderstorms created nighttime drama during summer months. The stone structures protected inhabitants from lightning to some degree, but strikes could still damage castles, particularly if they hit wooden elements in roofs or towers. The noise of thunder echoing through stone chambers could be startling and frightening, particularly for children. Heavy rain could penetrate roofs and windows, wetting sleeping areas. Autumn brought the return of cold weather and the knowledge that winter approached. The harvest season meant food was plentiful, providing good nutrition that helped prepare bodies for winter hardships. However, the shortening days and cooling temperatures signalled the end of relatively comfortable sleeping conditions and the return of cold nighttime misery. Autumn storms could be severe, with winds damaging roofs and rain penetrating structures. The seasonal transition meant variable weather, that made it difficult to predict what sleeping conditions would be like from one night to the next. The falling leaves that created beauty outside also accumulated in castle spaces, creating debris that added to general uncleanliness. The preparation for winter that occupied autumn included gathering extra firewood, checking that roofs and walls were sound, and making what repairs could be completed before weather became too severe. These preparations reflected awareness that winter sleeping conditions would be harsh, and that whatever could be done to mitigate that harshness needed to happen while weather still permitted. Weather events beyond seasonal patterns created their own impacts on sleeping conditions. Heavy rain could penetrate roofs despite their supposedly weatherproof construction, creating drips that wetted bedding and forced people to move sleeping locations or position containers to catch water. Prolonged wet periods increased the dampness that permeated castles, making everything feel clammy and uncomfortable. Extreme wind could create drafts throughout castles despite shuttered windows and closed doors. The whistling of wind through gaps and openings created noise that prevented peaceful sleep. Strong winds also increased fire hazards by blowing sparks from fireplaces and making torches, and candles burn unevenly. Fog and mist created their own atmosphere, with moisture condensing inside castles and creating wet surfaces. The reduced visibility from fog complicated nighttime security, as guards couldn't see as far from battlements and walls. The psychological impact of fog, creating an eerie, enclosed feeling, added to the general discomfort of nighttime castle conditions. The seasonal and weather variations meant that sleeping in castles involved constant adaptation to changing conditions. What worked for sleeping comfort in winter was inappropriate for summer. The preparations needed varied by season and current weather. This ongoing need for adaptation added to the general complexity of simply trying to get adequate rest in medieval castle environments. And so, as we step back from the cold stone chambers and dark corridors of medieval castles, we're left with a picture dramatically different from the romantic castles of fairy tales and fantasy. The reality of sleeping in these mighty fortresses was characterized by cold, darkness, discomfort, and genuine danger. Every night brought challenges that modern people, accustomed to heated homes, electric light, and secure sleeping spaces, can barely imagine. The physical environment of stone castles created baseline discomfort that affected everyone. Cold penetrated through thick walls, dampness permeated living spaces, and the hard surfaces provided no natural comfort. The architectural features that made castles defensible, thick walls, narrow windows, stone construction, also made them uncomfortable homes. The mighty fortresses that protected medieval people from enemies couldn't protect them from the harsh realities of pre-modern living conditions. The fire hazard that accompanied every attempt at heating and illumination created constant danger. The irony was cruel. People needed fire for warmth and light, but fire could also kill them and destroy their homes. This unavoidable tension between necessity and danger shaped nighttime routines and created persistent anxiety. The numerous historical accounts of catastrophic castle fires demonstrate that this danger was very real and frequently realized. The security threats that castles were built to defend against created their own nighttime anxieties. Guards had to maintain vigilance despite exhaustion and discomfort. People sleeping inside supposedly secure walls still worried about betrayal, siege, or violence. The weapons and defensive features that provided protection during attacks created their own hazards. During peaceful nights, security was relative, and even the best defended castles couldn't eliminate all danger. The health challenges created by medieval sanitation, limited medical knowledge, and crowded conditions meant that sleeping in castles involved exposure to numerous diseases and health risks. The parasites in bedding, the contamination from inadequate waste disposal, the spread of contagious diseases in crowded sleeping spaces, and the general uncleanliness of pre-modern life all contributed to health problems that modern people rarely face. Going to sleep healthy didn't guarantee waking healthy, and many illnesses struck during nighttime hours. The vermin and pests that shared castle spaces with humans created both nuisance and genuine danger. Rats potentially carrying plague, insects transmitting diseases, and various other creatures created unsanitary conditions and sometimes direct threats. The efforts to control these pests were largely ineffective given medieval technology, meaning that people simply had to accept cohabitation with numerous unwanted creatures. The profound darkness that descended at night created practical difficulties and psychological challenges. Navigation became dangerous, security was compromised, and the simple activities of daily life became complicated tasks requiring careful management of inadequate light sources. The darkness also triggered instinctive fear responses, creating emotional stress that affected sleep quality and mental health. The social hierarchy that structured all of medieval life extended even to sleeping conditions, with the comfortable accommodations of the elite contrasting sharply with the miserable conditions endured by servants and other low-status residents. This inequality was accepted as natural by medieval people, but contributed to the overall picture of castle life as being difficult for most inhabitants, despite the relative privilege of living in a fortress rather than simpler dwellings. The seasonal and weather variations meant that sleeping conditions changed throughout the year, creating ongoing challenges of adaptation. The winter cold, summer heat, autumn storms, and spring dampness each required different approaches. The single constant was that sleeping in castles was never truly comfortable, though some seasons were less uncomfortable than others. Despite all these challenges, medieval people adapted and survived. They developed routines that made sleep possible despite the difficulties. They accepted discomfort and danger as normal life conditions rather than exceptional problems. Their resilience in the face of challenges that would overwhelm most modern people demonstrates remarkable human capacity for adaptation and endurance. Understanding the reality of sleeping in medieval castles provides perspective on how much modern life has improved in terms of basic comfort and security. The heated homes, comfortable beds, electric lighting, and modern sanitation that contemporary people take for granted represent enormous advances over medieval conditions. The simple act of going to bed at night, something most modern people do without particular thought or anxiety, was a complicated, uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous activity for medieval castle residents. The romantic image of castles as magnificent palaces where noble lords and ladies lived in comfort and luxury is thoroughly misleading. While castles did represent wealth and power, they were fundamentally uncomfortable places to live. The sleeping experience, perhaps the most basic human need after food and water, was characterized by cold, darkness, danger, and discomfort that modern people would find intolerable. Yet this uncomfortable reality doesn't diminish the historical importance or architectural magnificence of medieval castles. These structures represent remarkable achievements in engineering, military science, and social organization. They protected populations during violent times and served as centers of power and culture. The fact that they were uncomfortable to live in reflects the limitations of medieval technology and the priorities of societies focused on defense and survival rather than comfort. The people who slept in medieval castles were fully human, experiencing the same desires for comfort, warmth, and security that people in all times and places have felt. They simply lived in circumstances where achieving those desires was far more difficult than in modern contexts. Their nightly experiences of cold, darkness, and danger shaped their worldviews, creating people who were tougher, more accepting of discomfort, and more aware of vulnerability than most modern people need to be. The legacy of medieval castles survives in the thousands of structures still standing across Europe, and in the cultural imagination, where castles remain symbols of a distant age. Modern visitors can tour these magnificent buildings, marvelling at their architecture and imagining medieval life. But to truly understand the castle experience, one must imagine not the romantic fairy tale version, but the reality. Cold stone chambers, insufficient heating, smoky fires, profound darkness, genuine dangers, and the constant effort required simply to achieve a night's rest. Sleeping in a medieval castle was dangerous because medieval life itself was dangerous, uncomfortable, and challenging in ways that modern life has largely overcome. The nighttime hours concentrated and magnified all the general difficulties of medieval existence, removing the distractions and activities of daytime, and leaving people alone with cold, darkness, and their vulnerabilities. Every night was a trial to be endured and survived, with morning bringing relief and the opportunity to face another day, until darkness fell again and the whole difficult process repeated.